Hello to all. Hope you are doing well. I'm here to discuss about connected graph, disconnected graph, and acyclic graph. A graph said connected if we can find between every pairs of that graph at least one path. Or in other words, we can say in a connected graph at least one path exists between every pair of vertices. This graph is a connected graph because between every pair of the vertex of this graph we can find a path. For example, between vertex number 1 and number 2 we have one path. Between the vertex number 2 and number 3 we have one path. And between vertex number 2 and number 3 we have two paths. And also between vertex number 2 and number 3 we have a path. It means between every vertex of this graph we have at least one path. Such graphs we are calling connected graph. Okay, let's go to disconnected graph. What is disconnected graph? In disconnected graph, if we cannot find at least between one pair of the graph a path, it is a disconnected graph. Or we can say there does not exist any path between at least one pair of the vertex. This graph is the graph G1 is a disconnected graph because between these vertex number if I consider vertex number 1 and vertex number 5, and here we don't have any path. They are not connected. This component, this graph, it has two components. They are not connected. And these types of graphs we are calling disconnected graph. And also a null graph is a disconnected graph. Moreover, any graph with isolated vertices disconnected. Any graph with isolated vertices, it is a disconnected graph. As we know, isolated vertices are vertex by 0 degree. For example, if I consider here one more vertex, vertex number 8, and this graph is also a disconnected graph. If I consider just this point component of this graph with this vertex, then it is also a disconnected graph. Okay, let's go to cyclic graph. Before to explaining cyclic graph, we have to know a cycle in a graph. A cycle in a graph, it is a cycle in a graph is a non-empty trail in which only the first and the last vertex are equal. The first and last vertex be equal. For example, I want to show in here a cycle in a graph. What is a cycle in a graph? It is a cycle. It is a graph, and if I start moving from vertex 1 to vertex 2, then come back to vertex 3, and finally vertex I remove from vertex 1 to vertex 2, vertex 2 to vertex 3, and then come back in the vertex 1. It means the first vertex and the last vertex of a trail when be same, then we say that trail is a cycle and a graph. It is a cycle. Okay, it is a cycle. And also we can consider this graph, and this graph also we can consider some cycle. If I label this graph by 1, 2, 3, the vertex of this graph 4, 5, like this, and here the cycle on this graph has different different cycle. For example, the cycle of this graph is 1, 2, 4, then 3, then 1. It is also a cycle of this graph. And another cycle of this graph is we can move from V1 to V5, and then V5 to V1, V3, and then come back V to V1. It is also a cycle of a graph. Okay. What is a cyclic graph? As a graph without cycle, we are calling a cyclic graph. A graph without cycle, it is a cyclic graph. Let me have an example here. We can consider this graph. It is a graph, then we will discuss. It is a 2 graph. This graph is a cyclic graph. A cyclic graph means in this graph is we cannot find a cycle. We cannot find a cycle in this graph. It means if I move from a vertex without visiting again the vertex, we cannot come from the starting points. So such these graphs we are calling cyclic graph. Thanks for being here. It was today's video.